This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin with K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen, joining us for a conversation on deductions for residual soil fertility. Roger shares that the deductions are the most useful for cropland, but it's not quite worth the time and effort for pasture and rangeland. Also ahead, we continue our series on water this week with two of our friends from Hays, Kansas. K-State watershed specialist Stacie Minson and water conservation specialist with the city of Hays, Holly Dickman, share insight on the ongoing work in Hays with the goal of encouraging water conservation in more urban areas. We end with this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts, where K-State experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers answer a listener's question on where to find the best information regarding cattle. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and we are joined now by Roger McEowen from K-State and Washburn University School of Law for this week's Agricultural Law Update. So thanks so much for joining us, Roger.
Good to be with you, Samantha.
Absolutely. So this week, you wanted to cover something that was recently brought to your attention. It's residual soil fertility is the broad idea.
Yeah, it's something I've been working on for quite some time. It's an issue that I've spoken on for a number of years, but it's recently been brought back to my attention by a number of practitioners back down in Texas in December, Nebraska, and Kansas, and Iowa, because there are firms that are really pushing this concept. And let me give you a little background to what this is. It's known as excess or residual soil fertility, and the tax code under Section 180 does allow a deduction for soil conditioners, fertilizer, lime that you add to the property. And the concept here is if I buy farmland and I have the soil content measured and it's determined by a professional soil scientist, agronomist, that there is an excess above what average is in that area for that type of soil, then I could allocate some of my purchase price to that excess and amortize that over the useful life of that, which would probably be about 3 to 4 years based on what the agronomist would say in their report. So along with other allocations that I can make when I buy a farmland to depreciable structures such as fences and maybe a barn or a storage facility, those types of things, I can reduce my effective purchase price by being able to claim some tax deductions. So that's the theory of this. Now, the way you go about it, IRS has said a couple of things over the years. Back in 1991, they put out what we call a technical advice memorandum on it, and then they also produced in the 1990s, I think it was along about 1994, what's known as a market segment specialization program paper on this, which is basically a training guide for their auditors as to this particular issue. And so we have those as professionals in the field to look at and say, okay, this is how you go about getting the deduction. You've got to have it measured. You have to have a beneficial ownership interest in the property. Have the soil test done at the time you buy the property. You don't want to wait too long because IRS is not going to like that. So have the soil testing done. See if there's an excess. If there is an excess, use the soil scientist, the agronomist report to allocate value to that. And then you set it up on your depreciation schedules and claim the deduction. And usually it's about, I would say, 60% in the first year and 30% the second year, and then clean it up with the remaining 10% in year 3 is usually how this is done.
So it's a messy process, it sounds like. And this is we're talking cropland in general right now.
Yeah, it takes a lot of work. There's a cost for the soil sampling and the testing and the report that's done, obviously, and there's a cost to prepare the return to claim the deduction. But there's a procedure to go through, and the IRS has blessed it as long as you follow their guidelines that they set forth in those two developments back in the 1990s, we can do this. But that's all the guidance that we have on it. They haven't said anything basically in 30 years with respect to it. So it can be valuable. If we're talking, for example, Iowa farmland that's $15,000 an acre, some of the most fertile land. I mean, some of that's gone most recently over $20,000 per acre. There was a tract, 120 acres, that sold actually where I'm from, where my family farms in northeast Indiana, about 20 miles east of us, that just sold for right at $20,000 per acre. And if you're able to allocate, in some instances, 20% of the value to excess soil fertility, that's a major deduction. We're talking, $5,000, $6,000 per acre that we're going to write off over 3 years. So what we're doing with all our other allocations is we're trying to drop that purchase price, my out-of-pocket cost in buying that farm, by virtue of deductions that we can claim through the tax code, and the excess fertility one can be a major one.
Sure. We're focusing on cropland right now, but when we think about the flip side of this when it comes to pasture or rangelands, is the same applicable?
Well, in theory, yes, because the code says, Section 180 of the code says that it applies also to land that is used for the sustenance of livestock. That's the code language. So that would mean your pasture land, your rangeland, your native grassland. Yeah, in theory, it applies. Now, when you apply the theory, maybe not so much, because for starters, you're starting with land that's not worth as much in terms of fair market value. So the Iowa cropland that sells for $15,000, pasture land in southern Iowa or in southwest Iowa may be $3,000 to $5,000. So you're starting at a lower level, and so any deduction based on that, based on an allocation, is going to be less, and so it's not going to be as beneficial on the tax return as if we were talking high-valued cropland that has excess fertility on it. Okay, so we start with that. Then there's the soil analysis itself. Pasture ground is not the same as crop ground, where we're adding nutrients to it, and then through the process of growing crops that take the nutrients out of the soil, then we add the nutrients back in. So that's going on all the time. With pasture ground, that's not the case. And so our phosphorus levels are different. Our nitrogen levels are different, and they're lower than what we would find with crop ground, where we're adding those nutrients to the soil. So my percentage allocation, even if there is an excess, is going to be less than the percentage allocation would be with cropland. So we start with a lower base, then we're going to have a lower percentage, and then when you actually do the math in terms of the deduction, in most instances, I think the vast majority of instances, it's not going to be worth it from an economic standpoint to go through this process to determine what your deduction might be. The deduction is not going to be worth the cost of the soil analysis, the cost of the agronomic report, the cost of the tax return preparer to prepare the return to claim the deduction. You're going to be underwater by the time you get all that done. But you will have a nice report on what your nutrient content is in your soil, but that's probably about all you're going to get.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can do that without having to go through the rest of the hoops that we just discussed. So fair point there to make, Roger. And I know that you mentioned that this is a federal code. So this is something that's, across the entire nation is something that's applicable. But there's a little bit of nuance here state to state, right?
Yeah. Some states take the position that they're not going to allow it just simply because they don't like it. And that's a personal thing in Department of Revenues from state to state. Now, most states are not like that. Most states will couple with the feds, and if you can claim it on the federal return, then they will allow it on the state return. But there are some states where simply the Department of Revenue has personnel that simply do not believe in this at all, and they put their foot down and they will disallow it on the state return. So in those states, we just take it on the federal return and ignore the state to avoid any controversy. But most of the time, we can also claim it on the state return, too, for state income tax purposes. But you're right, it is a federal provision. It's Section 180 of the Internal Revenue Code. I would caution listeners that there are some firms out there that do the soil testing. They're very aggressive on it, and you have to be cautious on that. Always get your tax practitioner on board early and have them engaged in the process, preferably before the sampling is done, so they can advise you on the tax ramifications of this. The last thing that we want is somebody to buy a farm, spend several $100,000s on purchasing the farm on the belief that they're going to get a large tax deduction because of excess soil fertility, and then find out later that it's not nearly as big or maybe even non-existent compared to what they thought was going to be the deduction. We don't want that to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a difference that might make you think twice before purchasing something that large.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. So, Roger, when it comes to even just law professionals, when they're thinking about advising, people in their world about this subject, what should be their first question that comes to mind?
Well, when we have a client that buys farm ground, we want to make sure that we're doing an allocation to depreciable items. This excess soil fertility or residual soil fertility, it's referred to both ways, can be a major component of that, particularly with respect to crop ground, particularly with respect to very highly productive crop ground. So we want to make sure that we make the allocation if we're able to. We don't want to miss it. It's not one we want to miss. However, We do have to follow the procedures as outlined by the IRS, and we have to be careful, particularly careful with its application to non-crop ground, any type of grazing land.
Absolutely. Yeah. Some great insight there today, Roger. And of course, you've written a blog post about this recently as well. So we'll link to that on AgManager as well as on your blog, right?
That's correct.
Absolutely. Well, Roger, thanks so much for joining us today and hopefully answering some questions out there for some listeners about, this issue of can I include this as a deduction or not? So thanks so much.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State and Washburn University School of Law professor Roger McEowen joining us for this week's Ag Law Update. If you're listening to us on the radio and are afraid you're going to miss out on our next segment because you're reaching your destination or have something else that you're having to switch to quickly here, don't forget that Agriculture Today programming is also available as a podcast. Our podcast is easily accessible on all podcasting platforms, including our website, agtoday.net, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. You can simply search us on any podcasting platform, Agriculture Today, Kansas State, and we are more than likely to pop up and you can follow us there. That way you can simply have us pop up in your regular feed on whatever platform you're using and listen to us more regularly that way. Once again, you can easily access that on agtoday.net or any podcasting platform by simply searching Agriculture Today, Kansas State. We're cutting to a short break now, but still to come when we return from that break is a continuation of our series on water. And this week, we're joined by two of our friends from the city of Hays here in Kansas. We're joined by K-State Watershed Specialist Stacie Minson and Water Conservation Specialist with the City of Hays, Holly Dickman. They join us to share insight on the ongoing work in Hays with the goal of encouraging water conservation in more urban areas and how that ties into extension programming. Once again, that conversation is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by several friends. They are from the city of Hays, and they're joining us for a conversation on urban water use in Hays specifically. And to join me in that conversation, we have with us Stacie Minson. She is a KSU watershed specialist. Stacie, thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you.
And we also have with us Holly Dickman. She is the water conservation specialist with the city of Hays. So Holly, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So obviously, Hays, it's funny to say the word urban, I think. You kind of giggled when I said that the first time, Holly. Because it is a smaller community, but when we think of Western Kansas, it is an urban community, right?
It is an urban community and certainly one of the larger cities in that part of the state, at least, northwest part of the state. So yes, I definitely think it's going to town. That's how it was when I grew up.
Yeah, for sure. And from what I understand, there has always been groundwater that the city has been using. But in the 90s, you guys ran into a problem where there were supply concerns, right?
Right. So Hays is a little bit unique. Ellis County is a little bit unique where we rely solely on groundwater, mostly from alluvial aquifers around the Smoky Hill River and Big Creek, which runs through Hays. And so as you can imagine, if it doesn't rain, maybe those rivers and creeks aren't running quite as much as they would be otherwise. And so our well levels can decline. And obviously, if you have a city that's relying on those water sources, you get a little concerned when there's no rainfall and well levels start to fall. So yes, back in the early 90s, there was a almost crisis in a situation where the city was not able to provide enough water for their citizens. And so that's where water conservation really took off and began in the city of Hays. And so ever since then, it's been a very high priority, and we continue that to this day.
So with water conservation and water quantity also comes quality, right, Stacie?
Yes, and that's where my role fits in. We have a watershed plan. Ultimately, our area is what drains into Canopolis Reservoir in Ellsworth County. So as you mentioned, City of Hays being urban for our watershed. So that's where we tie in water quality and water conservation. One of the projects that we do are rain barrels. It's a water conservation benefit on Holly's side, but for us, it's capturing the water as it's coming off of roofs, running off of yards, off of parking lots, or down curbs, and we're protecting water quality as we go.
Absolutely. And as a municipal city, you guys have put several policies in place or programs as well. Obviously, the rain barrels collecting water, a great program for sure. But in the 90s, you guys were really forced to adjust. So what were some of those water policies that you put in place?
So one of the biggest ones, I think, was the adoption of some ordinances where the wasting of water is actually prohibited. And so we can actually have tickets given by the Hayes Police Department for the wasting of water or the misuse of water, those sorts of things. But also our water rate structure is such that the more water you use, the greatly more you will pay. And so that's probably one of the biggest things that came out of that. The other thing that occurred was a big push for efficient fixtures, low flow shower heads, high efficiency washing machines. And so from that day forward, there was more of an effort to educate the public on some of those types of things, and then also to put in place some rebates and programs. And that was all the result of a half-cent sales tax that was actually passed back in the early 90s by the citizens in that area to search for a new water source. And water conservation is itself a water source, if you think about it that way. So if you're saving some of that water, then that's its own water source. So that was really took off in the early 90s.
K-State plays a role in kind of the education factor of this in Hayes, right?
Yes, for sure. Years ago, the city was working on their stormwater ordinances and their educational, and we had been in doing the watershed plan, working with the cities, the counties, governments, private farm bureaus, local county conservation districts, NRCS, across the watershed. And so one of our connections were, because Hayes is that urban, is how do we educate those urban residents while we still want to work on the agriculture side? So that's how Extension ties in. We work with the county Extension office, the county agents. And then Holly's a former Ellis County horticulture agent with Extension. So we already had that working relationship as agents. And so it worked really well for us to partner and get people to put the connection together on the conservation and the quality that they do go hand in hand.
You mentioned Canopolis earlier, and that's the major reservoir that fuels Hayes in a lot of ag communities, right?
It doesn't actually fuel Hayes, but the drainage that comes down the creeks and rivers, Big Creek drains into the Smoky Hill River. In Russell County, the Smoky Hill River travels the rest of the way to the reservoir, and it's the oldest reservoir in the state of Kansas, and it's a federal drinking water supply, so it provides water to the city of Ellsworth. Many people, Post Rock Rural Water District is where the water goes. It's treated, goes back outlets. So on farmers, ranchers, they provide livestock supply. There's homeowners that's their water supply at their farms and ranches. And then it goes back up into Russell County to help fuel the ethanol plant, because the city of Russell has a partnership with the city of Hayes as well, looking at a long-term water supply. So for us, it's everything that we're doing on the west end of the watershed, which includes Hayes, goes downstream and does affect that reservoir. And all of us, like you mentioned earlier, we want that clean, safe water supply, and we want the water when we need it.
Through our discussion this whole time, I'm just hearing the connectedness, all of these different communities and water sources in Western Kansas, how connected they really are. Is that a general theme that you guys feel is common in your work?
Well, I'm biased talking about water, obviously, but I think water touches everyone, right? So how can we not make that connection between the water that comes out of our faucet at home versus the water that's flowing down the stream through town or maybe out in the countryside? I think it all connects, and certainly some places it's a little more interconnected than others. But for us, the connection there is, I mentioned that I work by myself. I'm a team of one in my position. And so having to partner with others too, connecting that way is definitely a benefit to us. And so we try to partner anytime we can.
Absolutely. So water is one of those resources where when I think about restrictions or, loss of water sources, it raises a lot of alarms for a lot of people, right? It's one of those resources we have to form a society that's functional. So when concerns over the water resources in Hayes were first brought up, what sort of feelings arose with that?
Obviously, when you're talking about big changes, talking about water restrictions, there's always a lot of talk about those things. So I think the biggest thing is there was a great deal of education given. Obviously, we were in a position where we just really didn't have a choice, right? We had to do something. And so that unfortunately was a point where, yeah, it was helpful to get some of those things changed, but it also was a point of contention for some with restrictions and things like that, I've been told. And so, trying to educate the public, try to get those things in place. I mentioned that half-cent sales tax. That was voted on by the citizens there. So it wasn't something that was just forced upon. I mean, there was some knowledge that that was going to be taking place with that vote, obviously.
You know, we've talked about lots of things here already, and some might be thinking, well, why are we talking about urban water on an agriculture program? But Hays is an agriculture-centered community, I would say. So when we think about the lessons that were learned in Hays in this specific situation and how it's taken place over several decades now at this point, what are some of the major takeaways that you believe the city of Hays has learned in the process?
I personally am thankful that we started those programs back in the 90s, because having gone through the drought of 2011, 2012, where some of our neighboring communities had absolutely no outdoor water use completely, we were not having to go to those extremes because we were still in good shape. So having some of those lessons, you know, back then, kind of hard knocks back in the day, but now we're set in some of those programs and seen as, you know, the leaders in the state as far as water conservation goes with some of our outreach and education and programs and things. I think that's one of the biggest things is just we've learned that that was a good thing back in the day. Get it started, and now it's kind of a way of life there, right? Stacie and I go into schools all the time and talk to kids, and we hear from kids, you know, hey, I remember that. And then when they move away from the community and they see water wasting or, you know, someone watering the lawn at 2 p.m, they're like, they shouldn't be doing that. You know, it's wasting water. So I think just having those types of lessons, yeah, that was a great thing that we did back then. Adjusting to the times, maybe working with businesses and working on even new building codes and things that emphasize water efficiency. That's all in place in the city now. So I think those were some of the lessons that were definitely well learned.
Stacie, as we continue to tie this into kind of K-State's role in the broader picture of water use and conservation and quality concerns across the state of Kansas, but even more so in western Kansas, what role does K-State really play in facilitating these conversations?
The biggest thing is still our K-State research and extension mission, you know, being there, being the education, being the non-biased. And for us in the city of Hays, when we look at watershed work, for those that are familiar with the city of Hays, Vine Street travels north and south. So on the west side of that, there's one watershed. On the east side, there's another watershed. Ultimately, they both drain into Big Creek, which again travels downstream to Russell, to Ellsworth, ultimately to the reservoir. But residents can see Big Creek. They go play in Big Creek. There's a bridge. There's stepping stones. So when the droughts come and there's not as much water, or when we do get the rains and the water is way up there and they can't go out on some of these places, it's that education again. We've done field days at the park. We've done different things to bring people down there. We've went and toured the drinking water treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, and Holly and I are in the process. It's been a few years since we've done that, and it's not really something most people think, oh, hey, let's go to this meeting and tour the wastewater treatment plant. But it really gives perspective from when you turn the faucet on to when you turn it off. And so we have that educational component to make it applicable, to show that we're working on the urban side on picking up pet waste to reduce nitrogen and bacteria, to educating on, do you really need soil fertilizers? Maybe you should do a soil test. So you call your local county extension office, take the soil test. So then we can go where Holly works on the native vegetation, converting to buffalo grass, which there's an incentive rebate for homeowners in the city of Hays. Looking at that xeriscaping and use of native vegetation instead of rocks. So for us, it's putting the dynamics together on the urban side so that we can let the ag community know, hey, we're doing our part. We want to work with you on the water quality side, but we're also working on the education. And the education that we do, whether it's for the city of Hays, it's applicable across the watershed, ultimately across the state.
Yeah, I would say, you know, what place does K-State hold? Obviously, I have a past career in extension, so just the promotion of the right plants in the right places, not only on the ag side, but on the urban side as far as landscapes and things like that go. That's huge. How to deal with drought stress, how to deal with excessive rainfall. Those are all educational opportunities there that I hope never go away, because that is very, very important in my role now as water conservation specialist. It really is important to have someone local that maybe is familiar with those things, because we all know the western half of the state is much different than the eastern half of the state. And so I always emphasize that. So it's really important to keep that education going.
Absolutely. And if listeners are tuning in and they're looking for these resources that we've talked through today, there's been lots of them. What's a general place that they can go for their best first look at some of this information?
Well, I'm going to promote watersmarthays.com. That's our website, and I have links there to some of the resources for extension even, and water smart landscaping and right plants for Hays, Kansas, and those sorts of things. But I know Stacie on the extension side has lots of resources
and
as well.
My website is mykansaswatershed.com. There's the urban and the ag. And the other thing is your local county agent. I mean, there's a list of suggested trees, recommended plants. And that's the one great benefit. Holly and I have done some work in the last several years with Hays Medical Center. We have native vegetation. They've used some different things. And so there's signage saying that this is a native vegetation.
Yeah, and at the Extension office, we have a demonstration garden. So we partnered with our local Extension office and got that worked up, and you can see the plants there that are suited for our environment, and they're trying to test them a little bit now with this drought going on, but that was the whole goal, to see how few or how little we could get by with watering.
But again, extension, that's what we're here for, is to answer those questions, whether it's horticulture, agriculture, family and consumer sciences. They ultimately all go hand in hand. And so just getting people to know there are people that can help you with the right plant, the right place, protecting water supplies, conserving water supplies, because there's definitely a need.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming here today. And I know it was a long journey from Hays, but I really do appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was Stacie Minson. She is a KSU watershed specialist, as well as Holly Dickman, a water conservation specialist with the city of Hays, joining us for a conversation on urban water use. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We're ending today's programming with our friends from the Beef Cattle Institute for this week's Ask the Experts. This week, we're joined by K-State experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers.
Hi, welcome to Beef Cattle Institute's Ask the Experts. Happy to have you with us, and always happy to have some of your questions. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, you can send it to bci@ksu.edu. I've got two great experts with me today, Dr. Brian Lubbers.
Morning.
And Dr. Bob Larson.
Hello, guys.
And we're going to jump right in because we've got a great listener question. And as you guys remember, your answers can get up to 10 points. So I'm going to start with the question, and they wanted to know some new information, make some changes to my operation. Where's the best place to get that information? Should I watch and learn from other producers, or should I use university resources, or are there other places? Brian?
I'm going to say the internet. No, I'm totally joking. No, because I think you can actually get good information from your colleagues. And I know we all have the jokes about the coffee shop talk or whatever, but I really do think there is some valuable information there. I don't think you have to repeat all the mistakes on your own. But the word of caution I have, and we say this all the time on Cattle Chat, is it depends, right? And so their operation is going to be different than yours. And if you don't account for those differences, I think you really run the risk of making some huge mistakes because you didn't account. So what worked for them may not work for you at all. So I'm actually going to say I think there's some great information out there from your fellow producers.
From colleagues or peers. So 6 points for Brian out of the gate. Bob?
I agree that there's some real value in some experience, particularly, and I'm going to focus on local, in that the cattle business is so impacted by climate and environment. So an area of the country that gets more rain or farther north or farther south, those can really impact. That's going to be honestly true for both experience. So if you go to a cattleman's meeting or you get on the internet and you see a cattleman from a different part of the country that talks about something that really worked for them, or you look at research from a different part of the country, I think you have to filter it through what's locally available. So, but then the other thing that really stretches my mind sometimes is to be challenged by somebody that does things totally different. So, talking to cattlemen or research from Florida or from, the Northwest part of the United States or from South Africa, and then asking yourself, would it work here? I'm going to answer, just to be different than Brian, I'm going to say use university research, but I would get to know the people in your area, your extension people, your state extension specialists, and start there with some of these questions that you might have.
I'm going to give you 5 points because you said think local, but then look at research from all over the country. So you kind of answered both. So you would think you'd get more points, but you answered both. Now, let's talk university research. So Brian, pros and cons of university research, and Bob, I'll come back to you.
Easy pro for university research is it's generally pretty unbiased, right? And so when we talk about research in general, there's sponsored research. When we say sponsored research, we generally mean, it's a company. It's a genetics company. It's a pharmaceutical company. And they do very high quality research. Don't get me wrong. But there's a thing called publication bias where sometimes if it doesn't work out, we never see the results of that. University research, unbiased. No matter what the outcome was, you're probably going to see it in a publication somewhere. I think the biggest con for university research is, I would say for just the everyday run-of-the-mill producer, it's difficult to interpret. We deal with a range of questions from very basic science to applied science, and sometimes we just don't get to the how would that impact an individual producer's operation.
Brian's got 8 points. Bob, university research, pro and con?
I think one of the pros, as Brian said, is it's unbiased. And again, I love the United States land grant system. I think that is one of the greatest decisions that was made as far as how do you try to make some of those research questions as applicable as possible. I'm going to say that's one of the reasons I really do like. I spent some time in extension, and I think there's some real value in kind of combining that local knowledge, the producer level knowledge, with some controlled randomized studies, which is kind of the heartbeat of the university. And so I don't know how to answer this question other than use the university research through the extension system, but it's always filtered through the local extension agent, the other producers in the area. It's always filtered through that. So I don't think this has to be an either or. I think it's how do you use university research filtered through your local situation to come up with the best answers.
Excellent answer, Bob, but a little bit over time. So I'm going to have to dock you a point for that. Brian ends up with 8. You end up with 7. Thanks for joining us. If you have other questions, you can send us an email at bci@ksu.edu.
Once again, those were K-State experts Brad White, Bob Larson, and Brian Lubbers from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.